never marry you or accept this baby." He raged. But 9 months later, he saw her with the newborn. One hospital door broke his heart open. The hospital corridor stretched ahead in quiet stillness, the kind that makes every footstep sound louder than it should. Roger Conroy slowed as he reached the end of the hall, his polished shoes suddenly feeling too heavy for a man who once moved through boardrooms without hesitation. Somewhere beyond the half-closed door, a newborn cried. Soft, fragile, insistent. The sound carried through the hallway like a question waiting for an answer. Nurses passed behind him, speaking in low voices, but he barely heard them. Roger lifted his hand toward the door handle and stopped. His fingers trembled. This was the same man who signed contracts worth millions without blinking. Yet now a simple door seemed harder to face than any negotiation he had ever won. 9 months earlier, in a room filled with anger and pride, he had said words he could never take back. "I'm not ready to accept this baby." At the time, the sentence felt practical, necessary, controlled. Standing here now, it felt like a weight pressing against his chest. He stared at the narrow opening, listening to that small cry again. How did a man who controlled entire companies end up afraid of a room barely 10 steps away? To understand this moment, we have to go back. Have you ever said something in the heat of fear that you wished you could erase the second it left your mouth? Sometimes it's not anger that pushes people away. Sometimes it's responsibility, the kind that doesn't come with an exit plan. Roger had built a life most people dream about: money, influence, respect. Yet none of those things prepared him for a decision that required something he had avoided for years: emotional risk. At his core, Roger believed control was safety. If he could measure it, schedule it, or negotiate it, he could win. Feelings didn't follow rules, and that made them dangerous. Every major success in his life came from staying detached. No distractions, no emotional commitments that could slow momentum. That discipline turned him into one of the youngest self-made millionaires in the city. But the moment waiting behind that door wasn't a business problem. It was personal. And for the first time in years, Roger was about to face something he couldn't manage with strategy or confidence. Tonight's story is about how a man who trusted numbers more than people was forced to confront the one thing he couldn't calculate: his own heart. One sentence, spoken in fear, set off 9 months of silence, distance, and regret that success couldn't cover. And it all began on a night that seemed ordinary, an event filled with polite smiles, quiet music, and a chance encounter he almost ignored. To everyone joining us for the first time, and to those who always return for these journeys, welcome. Settle in, because this one is less about wealth and more about what it really costs to avoid responsibility. If stories about real change and second chances speak to you, take a second to like the video. It helps these stories reach more people who might need them tonight. I'd also love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments. This channel is built on shared experiences from different walks of life. And if you appreciate powerful, life-shifting storytelling like this, make sure you're subscribed for more real-life transformation stories, because the moment that changed Roger Conroy's life started with a simple spill of red wine at a charity gala. Roger Conroy was 34 years old, and in most business circles his name carried quiet weight. Magazines called him one of the youngest self-made millionaires in the city. Investors called him precise. Competitors called him dangerous. Employees called him efficient, never warm, never cruel, just exact. He owned a chain of luxury hotels that catered to people who never asked for prices. He held commercial properties in districts where land rarely stayed available for long. His investment firm handled numbers large enough to make most people pause before speaking. Roger never paused. His calendar was booked months ahead, every hour assigned a purpose. Meetings began on time. Calls were filtered before they ever reached him. Decisions were made quickly, often before others finished explaining their pitch. To him, hesitation was expensive. People admired what he had built. That kind of rise didn't happen by accident, and even those who disliked him respected the discipline behind it. But admiration and understanding are not the same thing. In rooms filled with executives, he spoke only when necessary. No small talk, no wasted stories. If a conversation didn't lead somewhere useful, he ended it politely and moved on. It wasn't arrogance. It was training. Years earlier, when his first business nearly collapsed under debt, he learned a lesson that never left him. Emotion clouds judgment, and clouded judgment costs money. Since then, he had treated feelings like background noise, useful sometimes, dangerous if given too much attention. His mornings began before sunrise, a short workout, black coffee, financial reports reviewed before most of the city woke up. By the time others checked their messages, Roger had already made 3 decisions that would affect hundreds of employees. Efficiency wasn't just a habit, it was his identity. At networking events, people laughed a little louder around him trying to impress. Some watched their words carefully, afraid of saying something that might close a door. Others approached with rehearsed charm, hoping proximity to a success might change their own trajectory. Roger noticed all of it. None of it moved him. Compliments felt transactional. Praise usually came attached to a request. Over time, he stopped looking for sincerity in professional spaces because he rarely found it. If someone asked what motivated him, he would give a simple answer. Results. Not passion, not legacy, not happiness. Results. That mindset made him reliable in high-pressure situations. When markets shifted or deals became unstable, Roger didn't panic. He adjusted, calculated, executed. It also made his personal life quiet. His penthouse overlooked the city's skyline, all glass and clean lines, designed more for presentation than comfort. The view was impressive, especially at night when lights stretched across the horizon like proof of constant motion. Most evenings, though, the space held only silence. Dinner was often delivered and eaten while reviewing contracts. Music rarely played. The television stayed off unless financial news was running in the background. There were no framed photos on the walls, no signs that anyone else had ever lived there. If loneliness visited, it did so quietly enough that Roger could ignore it. And ignoring uncomfortable things was something he had mastered. In his experience, attachment complicated decisions. Relationships introduced variables that couldn't be predicted or controlled. He preferred environments where outcomes depended on preparation and logic. Feelings didn't follow logic, so he kept them at a distance. To outsiders, his life looked enviable. Wealth, influence, independence, the kind of success people chase for decades. But success built on constant control comes with an unspoken cost. It leaves very little room for moments that can't be scheduled. Roger didn't see that as a problem. To him, structure meant safety. If every major choice could be analyzed before action, mistakes could be minimized, losses reduced, weakness avoided. That belief had protected him more than once. It had also built walls so subtle he barely noticed them anymore. The truth was, Roger hadn't always been this guarded. Earlier versions of him had trusted faster, spoken more freely, believed effort alone could fix every problem. Experience changed that. Deals gone wrong, partners who disappeared when risks appeared, opportunities that required choosing survival over sentiment. Each situation reinforced the same conclusion: control what you can, detach from what you can't. By 34, that philosophy had turned him into a man who could manage crises without raising his voice, a man who could walk away from emotional conversations without looking back, a man who measured progress in percentages instead of memories. And for years that approach worked. His companies grew, his reputation strengthened, his name opened doors before he even entered the room. From the outside it looked like a perfect system, until the night a small, ordinary moment introduced something he couldn't quantify. Because the biggest changes rarely announce themselves with noise. Sometimes they arrive quietly, holding a tray of wine glasses in a crowded ballroom, waiting for a man who believes he's immune to distraction. That was the version of Roger Conroy the world recognized. Focused, controlled, untouchable. What no one realized yet was how close he was to meeting the one person who would make all that control feel surprisingly fragile. The ballroom shimmered with polished elegance, the kind designed to impress before a single word was spoken. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, scattering soft light across marble floors that reflected every movement. A small jazz band played near the stage, their music warm but unobtrusive, pleasant enough to fill silence, forgettable enough not to interrupt conversation. Events like this were less about charity and more about visibility. Roger Conroy stood near the balcony, one hand resting lightly against the railing as he listened to a man enthusiastically explain a partnership proposal he had already decided to decline. "Yes, we're projecting significant growth over the next 2 quarters, the man said, smiling too eagerly. Roger gave a polite nod. "I'll have my office review the numbers," he replied calmly. It was the kind of answer that sounded open while meaning no. Below them, clusters of guests moved through the room with practiced confidence. Tailored suits, measured laughter, business cards exchanged with subtle urgency. Conversations sounded important, yet most of them circled the same familiar themes: expansion, influence, positioning. Roger had attended enough of these events to recognize the rhythm. Smile, listen, exit gracefully. He adjusted the cuff of his white shirt, already planning how soon he could leave without appearing dismissive. That was when he noticed her. Not because she was trying to be noticed, but because she wasn't. Near the far wall, a young woman moved carefully between guests, carrying a tray of wine glasses. Her uniform was simple, neat, practical. Her hair was tied back, expression calm, focused on not interrupting anyone's conversation. She wasn't scanning the room for attention, she was simply doing her job well. Roger's attention lingered for a second longer than he intended. There was something different about the way she moved, unhurried, steady, unaffected by the pressure that usually filled rooms like this. Most staff at high-profile events carried a certain tension, a quiet rush to avoid mistakes. She didn't. She moved like someone who had accepted that mistakes might happen and would handle them if they did, laughing at something behind him. His elbow clipped the edge of the tray. One glass tipped. Time seemed to slow just enough for everyone nearby to notice. Red wine spilled in a sharp arc and landed directly across the front of Roger's white shirt. The music continued, but the conversation around them paused. The guest froze. I'm so sorry. The young woman immediately set the tray aside and reached for napkins. I'm so sorry, sir, she said softly, already trying to blot the stain before it spread. People nearby watched carefully, waiting. Moments like this often revealed who someone really was. Roger glanced down at the deep red mark across the fabric. For a brief second, the room expected irritation. Instead, he exhaled once and said calmly, "It's just a shirt." The tension broke almost instantly. The guest let out a relieved breath. "Thank you, I thought I'd just ruined your evening." Roger gave a small, dismissive shake of his head. "I've had worse things happen over less." The young woman paused, surprised by the lack of anger. Her eyes lifted to meet his for the first time. "Still, I'm really sorry," she said. Her voice carried sincerity, not fear. An apology offered because she meant it, not because she was trying to protect herself. If you're just joining us, kindly subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with memorable stories like this one. Roger held her gaze for a brief moment. Up close, he noticed details he might normally overlook. Steady posture, clear eyes, composure that didn't feel rehearsed. "It's fine," he said quietly. For a second, something unspoken passed between them. Relief, gratitude, a flicker of curiosity neither of them had planned. Then his phone rang. The sharp vibration in his pocket snapped the moment in half. Roger stepped aside, answering without checking the screen. "Yes?" His expression shifted back to business within seconds. "I said move the meeting to Thursday. No, Thursday works. Handle the rest." When he ended the call and looked back, the tray was gone. So was she. The conversation around him resumed as if nothing had happened. The man beside him chuckled lightly. "Well, you handled that better than most people here would have." Roger adjusted his cuff again, eyes scanning the room once before settling back into neutrality. It wasn't worth making a scene. Yet, as the evening continued, through introductions, polite laughter, and predictable proposals, his attention drifted once or twice toward the far side of the ballroom. Not searching exactly, just noticing. He didn't know her name, didn't ask. By the time he left the event, the incident had already been filed away in the part of his mind reserved for minor, forgettable moments. Or at least that's what he told himself. Because in a life built on priorities and outcomes, a brief exchange with someone serving drinks shouldn't have mattered. It should have disappeared into the background like the music, the speeches, the practiced smiles. Instead, later that night, standing alone in his quiet penthouse, loosening his tie, Roger found himself remembering one small detail he couldn't quite explain. Not the spill, not the apology. The way she hadn't seemed intimidated by him. That was unusual. And unusual things had a way of returning when least expected. A week later, inside one of his own hotels, Roger Conroy would see her again, and this time, he wouldn't look away so quickly. A week passed before Roger saw her again. Long enough for the memory of the gala to settle into the background of his mind, filed somewhere between minor inconvenience and forgettable social obligation. His schedule had been packed as usual. Back-to-back meetings, contract reviews. A site inspection moved forward by 2 days because a partner wanted quicker confirmation. By mid-afternoon, Roger arrived at one of his flagship hotels downtown. The lobby carried its usual quiet prestige, polished floors, soft lighting, the faint scent of fresh flowers placed near the entrance every morning. Guests moved in and out with rolling luggage, voices low, footsteps measured. Roger walked in with purpose, his assistant a step behind him. "Your 3 o'clock is waiting in Conference B," she said, checking her tablet. "I'll be there in 10, he replied. He rarely lingered in common areas. Time spent observing instead of acting was time lost. But as he passed the front desk, something familiar caught his attention. A calm voice. "Let me repeat that for you slowly, sir," the receptionist said gently. "Your room is on the 4th floor, elevator to your left." Roger slowed. Behind the desk stood the same woman from the gala, Jada, though he still didn't know her name yet. She was helping an elderly couple who seemed slightly overwhelmed by the check-in process. The man held the room key carefully, as if afraid he might drop it. His wife leaned closer to hear better. Jada didn't rush them. She repeated each detail patiently, her tone steady, respectful, never forced. "Yes, breakfast is included," she added with a small reassuring smile. "And if you need anything at all, just dial 0 from your room." The couple thanked her more than once before moving toward the elevators. Roger remained where he was, watching longer than he intended. There was no performance in the way she spoke, no exaggerated friendliness, just genuine patience. His assistant noticed he had stopped. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked quietly. Roger's eyes stayed on the front desk. "No," he said after a moment. "No problem." He should have continued toward the conference room. Instead, he asked, "Who is she?" His assistant glanced toward the desk. "The receptionist?" "Yes." She checked quickly. "Jada Rao. She transferred here a few months ago from the Midtown property. Good performance reviews, no complaints from guests." Roger gave a small nod. "Reliable?" "Very," the assistant replied. "Managers say she handles difficult guests without escalation." Roger didn't respond immediately. Reliable. In his world, that word carried more value than charm. At the desk, Jada organized a stack of documents, unaware she was being observed. Her movements were efficient but unhurried, like someone accustomed to long shifts and steady responsibility. No nervous energy, no attempt to impress anyone walking past. Most employees straightened the moment they noticed him nearby, posture tightening, expressions shifting into careful professionalism. She didn't even look up. Roger found that unusual. "Reschedule a meeting for 15 minutes, he said quietly. His assistant blinked once, surprised, but nodded. "Yes, sir." He stepped closer to the desk. Jada looked up then, recognition flickering across her face. "The gala," she said softly. "White shirt." A faint, almost embarrassed smile touched her lips. "I owe you another apology for that." Roger glanced down at his suit, this time charcoal gray. "It survived," he replied. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. "I'm glad." There was no awkward scrambling for conversation, no exaggerated politeness, just calm acknowledgement. Roger rested one hand lightly against the counter. "You handled that situation well," he said. "The spill?" "The pressure." Jada shrugged gently. "Mistakes happen. Panicking usually makes them worse." Her answer was simple, practical, not something crafted to impress him. Roger studied her for a brief moment. "You always this calm?" he asked. "Or only at work?" She considered the question before answering. "I can't afford to panic, sir." The sentence landed with quiet weight, not dramatic, just honest. For reasons he couldn't immediately explain, that response stayed with him. In his world, people avoided panic because it looked unprofessional. In hers, it sounded like survival. Roger gave a small nod. "That's a useful skill." "It's a necessary one," she replied. A guest approached the desk with a question about parking, and Jada turned her attention smoothly without rushing. Roger stepped back, letting her continue. For the first time in a long while, he found himself observing someone not for evaluation, but out of genuine interest. No strategy behind it, no clear benefit, just curiosity. His assistant reappeared at his side. "They're ready for you," she said quietly. Roger glanced once more toward the desk. Jada was explaining directions again. Patient as before, fully focused on the guest in front of her. He turned toward the conference hallway. As he walked away, one thought surfaced unexpectedly. Most people either tried to impress him or avoided him entirely. She had done neither. And that, more than the gala, more than the spill, was the moment curiosity shifted into something intentional. Because for the first time in years, Roger Conroy had met someone who spoke to him. Not his money, not his reputation, just him. He didn't realize it yet, but that quiet difference was about to change how often he found reasons to visit that hotel. Jada Rao was 27 years old, and her life ran on structure. Not the kind created by wealth, but the kind built from necessity. Her mornings started earlier than she preferred, usually before sunrise, when the city still felt half asleep. A small alarm clock buzzed on the nightstand of the modest apartment she shared with her mother, and within minutes she was already moving. Quietly, carefully, so she wouldn't wake her. The apartment was clean but simple. Nothing extra. Every item had a purpose. On the kitchen counter sat a small notebook filled with numbers. Rent, medication, groceries, transport. Jada updated it almost daily, adjusting small expenses the way some people adjusted investment portfolios. Except hers wasn't about growth. It was about staying afloat. Her mother had been ill for years, not constantly hospitalized, but never fully well either. Doctor visits came in cycles, good months followed by difficult ones. Over time, medical bills had taught Jada a lesson she never forgot. Life rarely waits until you're ready. So she stopped waiting. By day, she worked the front desk at the hotel, long hours on her feet, welcoming guests who often arrived tired, impatient, or distracted. By evening, she attended accounting classes at a community college across town. The schedule left very little space for rest. But rest didn't pay bills. On most nights, she returned home with just enough energy to heat something simple for dinner before reviewing notes for the next day's lecture. Sometimes she fell asleep with a pen still in her hand. It wasn't glamorous, it was steady, and steady meant survival. Unlike many people her age, Jada wasn't chasing excitement or luxury. Stability was the goal. A reliable income, health insurance, the ability to handle an unexpected expense without panic. Small things, but powerful ones. At work, guests often assumed she was just another receptionist, someone passing time until something better came along. They didn't see the textbooks in her bag or the way she used quiet moments between check-ins to review formulas and budgeting strategies. They also didn't see how carefully she managed her emotions. When guests raised their voices, she listened. When someone complained unfairly, she stayed calm. When a long line formed and pressure built, her tone never sharpened. Not because she enjoyed being patient, because losing composure could cost her the job, and the job supported more than just her. Her manager once asked how she stayed so steady during stressful shifts. Jada had smiled lightly and replied, "I can't afford bad days." It wasn't a joke. Every paycheck covered medication, groceries, and tuition. One missed week of work could ripple through everything. So she became reliable, predictable in the best way. The kind of employee managers trusted with difficult situations because she didn't escalate problems. She absorbed them, softened them, redirected them. Outside of work, her world was smaller than most people expected. No expensive dinners, no spontaneous trips, no late-night parties. Occasionally she met a classmate for coffee after lectures, but even those outings were timed carefully around bus schedules. Transportation alone required planning. Miss one connection, and the journey home could double. Still, she rarely complained. There was a quiet pride in handling her responsibilities without drama. On weekends, if her mother felt strong enough, they watched old movies together. Simple stories, familiar endings. Those evenings were calm, almost sacred in their routine. "Did you eat?" her mother would ask, even when Jada was the one paying for groceries. "I did," Jada would answer, even if dinner had been little more than toast and tea. Care flowed both ways. Responsibility had matured her early. While others talked about dream jobs and future adventures, Jada focused on what could be built step by step. One completed semester, one bill paid on time, 1 month without unexpected emergencies, progress measured in inches instead of leaps. That mindset shaped how she saw people too. She didn't assume wealth meant happiness, didn't assume confidence meant strength. Life had shown her that appearances often hid quieter struggles, which was why, when she first met Roger at the gala, she hadn't been intimidated by his presence. To her, he was simply another person in an expensive room, well-dressed, important clearly, but still human. And when the wine spilled, her first thought hadn't been fear of his status. It had been concern that she had inconvenienced someone during their evening. Back at the hotel, she treated him the same way she treated every guest, respectful, professional, without unnecessary flattery. She never asked about his companies, never hinted at his wealth, never adjusted her tone to impress. Because in her world, survival depended on consistency, not charm, and consistency left very little space for pretending. If someone had told her that the quiet man in tailored suits would soon become a regular part of her thoughts, she would have dismissed it immediately. People from his world didn't cross into hers. Not in any lasting way. Their lives ran on different tracks, one built on expansion and risk, the other on caution and stability. Still, life has a way of ignoring the boundaries people assume are permanent. Without realizing it, Jada had already made an impression simply by being the one thing Roger rarely encountered, someone who wasn't trying to gain anything from him. And for a man accustomed to filtered conversations and calculated interactions, that kind of presence was more disarming than charm. In the weeks ahead, what began as brief, polite exchanges at a hotel desk would slowly shift into longer conversations neither of them planned. Because curiosity, when left alone long enough, tends to return, usually with a reason. At first, Roger told himself the extra visits were practical. A property he owned deserved regular oversight. Standards had to be maintained. Guest experience mattered. Small details, if ignored, could become expensive problems later. Reasonable explanations, on paper. In reality, most of those checks could have been handled with a report and a 5-minute call. Yet somehow, over the next 2 weeks, Roger found himself stopping by the hotel more often than his schedule required. Sometimes it was between meetings. Other times, late in the afternoon when his driver would normally head straight back to the office. "Let's swing by the downtown property," he would say casually, as if the decision had just occurred to him. His assistant never questioned it. Owners visited their properties all the time. Still, even she began to notice the pattern. Each visit followed the same rhythm. Roger entered the lobby, acknowledged the manager if he was nearby, walked a slow, observant path past the seating area, and almost without fail his attention drifted toward the front desk. Jada always greeted him the same way. "Good afternoon, Mr. Conroy." No nervousness, no exaggerated enthusiasm, just professional respect. The first few times their exchanges were brief. "How's occupancy this week?" he asked once. "High," she replied. "We've had several early check-ins. Another day. Any issues reported overnight?" "Nothing major. One maintenance request on the 5th floor, already handled." Efficient answers, clear. No unnecessary details. Exactly how he preferred communication. But unlike most professional interactions in his day, these didn't feel like negotiations. There was no angle behind her words, no attempt to impress him with statistics she thought he wanted to hear. If something was good, she said it was good. If something needed attention, she said that too. Honest, direct, calm. One evening, near the end of a long day, Roger stopped at the desk while the lobby sat nearly empty. Jada was organizing reservation forms, stacking them neatly. "You always this composed?" he asked, resting his hand lightly on the counter. She glanced up. "I try to be." "Try," he repeated. A small smile touched her lips. "Some days are louder than others. That's one way to put it." She set the papers aside. "Guests get tired, flights get delayed. People arrive already frustrated. If I meet them with the same energy, it only gets worse." Roger considered that. "So you absorb it instead." "Redirect it," she corrected gently. The distinction was subtle, but intentional. Most people in his world push pressure downward to someone else. She seemed to soften it before it spread. "That's a useful skill," he said. "It keeps my day manageable," she replied. A guest approached with a question about late checkout, and she shifted her focus instantly, voice steady, patient as always. Roger stepped back, watching again, not evaluating, observing. The difference mattered. Over the next few visits, their conversations stretched a little longer each time. Still appropriate, still professional, but less guarded. One afternoon he noticed a textbook partially hidden beneath the desk. "Studying something?" he asked. Jada nodded. "Accounting. Why accounting? Stable job," she said simply. He leaned slightly against the counter. "Not exciting?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "Excitement doesn't pay hospital bills." The answer landed heavier than its calm delivery suggested. In Roger's environment, people chased growth, influence, expansion. Here was someone chasing stability and speaking about it without embarrassment. No performance, no apology, just truth. He found himself thinking about that line later that night while reviewing investment projections. Excitement doesn't pay hospital bills. It wasn't a phrase anyone in his boardrooms would ever say. A few days later, he arrived earlier than usual. The morning rush had just ended, leaving the lobby quiet. Jada was helping a guest print travel documents. When she finished, she looked up and noticed him waiting. "I'll be with you in 1 second, she said. "No rush," Roger replied. And he meant it. Waiting wasn't something he typically tolerated well. Time was usually measured in outcomes. Yet standing there, listening to the soft hum of the lobby, he felt no urgency to move. When she returned her attention to him, she asked, "Inspection today? That obvious? You only come this early when something needs checking." A faint hint of humor colored her tone. Roger allowed a small smile. "Maybe I just like confirming things are running properly." "Or maybe," she said lightly, "you don't trust reports. That too." Their eye contact held a fraction longer than before. Comfortable, not forced. No one rushed to fill the silence. For Roger, that was unusual. Most conversations in his life were dense with purpose. Questions, numbers, decisions stacked back to back. Here, the pauses didn't feel inefficient. They felt steady. As days turned into weeks, his visits stopped needing justification, even in his own mind. He no longer framed them as inspections. They were simply part of his routine now. Walk in, check the lobby, exchange a few words at the desk, leave. Yet those few minutes had begun to shift something subtle in him. His tone softened without effort. His questions became less transactional. Once, after finishing a conversation, he started toward the elevators, then paused and turned back. "You handle pressure better than most managers I've worked with," he said. Jada tilted her head slightly. "Pressure doesn't scare me," she replied. "Uncertainty does." "Why uncertainty?" "Because you can't prepare for it." Roger absorbed that quietly. Preparation had always been his shield against risk, but some parts of life didn't send warnings. That thought stayed with him long after he left the building. By then, neither of them had acknowledged what was happening. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic shifts, just a pattern forming, steady, almost invisible. A powerful businessman adjusting his schedule without admitting why, and a receptionist who treated him exactly the same as everyone else. What Roger didn't realize yet was that these short, ordinary conversations were doing something no high-stakes deal ever had. They were slowing him down, and for the first time in years, that didn't feel like a loss. It felt grounding. By the time a month had passed, Roger's visits no longer surprised the staff. Owners came and went. Inspections happened. Presence at a flagship property was considered a good sign. Only Roger knew his reasons had quietly shifted. What began as observation had turned into something less defined, an unspoken pause in his day that he didn't rush through. Late evenings became his preferred time to stop by. The lobby then was calmer, the rush of arrivals already settled, business travelers either in their rooms or finishing quiet dinners in the restaurant downstairs. On one of those evenings, the seating area sat nearly empty. A soft instrumental track played overhead, low enough that it blended into the background. Jada stood behind the desk reviewing a reservation list. Roger approached without the usual sense of urgency that followed him everywhere else. "Long day?" he asked. She glanced up, surprised to hear the question framed that way. "A normal one," she said, "which is usually a good thing." He nodded once. "Normal is underrated." She gave a small, knowing smile, as if she understood more than he had said. A moment later, the quiet was interrupted by quick footsteps. A young boy, no older than 6, ran across the lobby, his mother a few steps behind, apologizing under her breath. "Slow down," she called softly. The boy turned too quickly, his shoe catching slightly against the polished floor. He stumbled, just enough to lose balance, then caught himself before falling. For a split second his eyes widened in shock. Then he grinned, proud he hadn't gone down. Jada laughed. It wasn't loud, not dramatic, just a soft, genuine laugh that slipped out before she remembered where she was. For that brief moment she wasn't an employee managing a space. She was simply someone reacting to something small and human. Roger turned toward her instinctively. The sound caught him off guard. It was unfiltered, real, the kind of reaction that didn't calculate who was watching. Jada quickly composed herself, clearing her throat as if to return to professional mode. But the moment had already landed. Roger realized, without meaning to, he was smiling. Not the polite, measured expression he used in meetings, a real one. It faded almost as quickly as it appeared, but the awareness of it lingered. He couldn't remember the last time something that simple had pulled a reaction out of him. "Kids recover fast," he said, more to himself than to her. "They don't overthink," Jada replied. "They just keep going." "That must be nice." "It is," she said quietly. "Until life teaches you to hesitate." The line settled between them, not heavy, just honest. Another guest approached the desk asking about a taxi. Jada handled the request smoothly, voice returning to its steady professional rhythm. Roger stepped aside, watching again. But this time, he wasn't studying efficiency or performance. He was noticing presence, the way she listened fully when someone spoke, the way she didn't rush people even when they repeated themselves, the way calm seemed to follow her instead of the other way around. When the guest left, the lobby returned to its soft quiet. "You're good at this," Roger said. "At what?" "Making people feel less stressed than when they walked in." Jada considered that. "Just try not to add to whatever they're already carrying." "That's rare," he said. "In your world?" she asked gently. "In most." She leaned slightly against the counter, relaxed but attentive. She asked. Roger almost gave his usual short answer, busy, efficient, productive. Instead, he paused. "Fast," he said after a moment. "Everything moves fast. And if you slow down, you fall behind." Jada studied his expression briefly. "Or," she said, "you finally notice what you've been running past." The comment wasn't confrontational, just thoughtful. Roger let out a quiet breath that might have been a soft laugh. "No one's ever said that to me." "That's because," she replied, "most people probably benefit from you staying busy." There was no accusation in her tone, just observation. For reasons he couldn't explain, that honesty didn't irritate him, it grounded him. Another short silence settled, comfortable, not awkward. Roger glanced around the nearly empty lobby. For the first time in years, he realized he wasn't thinking about the next meeting, the next call, the next decision waiting on his approval. He was simply standing there, present. It was unfamiliar, and strangely, peaceful. "I should let you get back to work," he said eventually. "I am working," she replied with a faint smile. He nodded, accepting that. As he turned to leave, he noticed something subtle but undeniable. The tension that usually sat between his shoulders, tight, constant, almost invisible, had eased. Not gone, just lighter. Upstairs in his penthouse later that night, reviewing reports under the glow of his desk lamp, the image returned unexpectedly. Not the numbers on the page, not the contracts awaiting his signature. Jada laughing, brief, unguarded. It replayed once, then again. Roger leaned back in his chair, staring at the skyline through the glass. He didn't analyze the moment, didn't try to assign meaning. He only recognized one simple truth. For the first time in a long while, something in his day had felt genuine. And that small, almost insignificant shift marked the first real crack in the emotional armor he had spent years building. The invitation wasn't dramatic. No grand setup, no carefully planned speech. It happened on an ordinary afternoon when the lobby was quiet enough that conversations didn't have to compete with rolling luggage or overlapping voices. Roger had just finished a short meeting upstairs and was on his way out when he slowed near the front desk. Jada was finishing a call, thanking a guest for their patience before placing the receiver down. When she looked up, she noticed he hadn't continued toward the exit. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Yes," he said. Then, after a brief pause, "Do you take breaks?" The question caught her slightly off guard. "Sometimes," she replied. "Why?" "There's a cafe across the street," Roger said, keeping his tone neutral. "I have 15 minutes before my next call." He didn't frame it as an invitation, just a statement. Jada studied him for a moment, as if weighing whether there was a hidden expectation behind the offer. There wasn't. 15 minutes, she said. "I can do that." The cafe was quiet, tucked between a pharmacy and a small bookstore that rarely had more than 2 customers at a time. No one looked twice when they walked in. For Roger, that alone was unusual. Most places shifted slightly when he entered, staff suddenly more attentive, conversations adjusting once his name was recognized. Here, the barista simply asked, "What can I get you?" "Black coffee," Roger said. Jada ordered tea. They chose a small table near the window. No assistants, no phones on speaker, no one waiting for a decision. Just 2 people sitting across from each other without titles between them. For a moment neither spoke. Not awkward, just unfamiliar. "You're different outside that building," Jada said finally. Roger raised an eyebrow. "How?" "You look less guarded." The comment was direct but not intrusive. He leaned back slightly, considering it. "No one's ever said that to me." "That's because," she replied gently, "most people don't talk to you. They talk to your money." The sentence landed without accusation, just truth. Roger let out a quiet breath that almost turned into a laugh. "That obvious?" "Only if you're watching," she said. He tapped his finger lightly against the side of his cup. "In my world, conversations usually have an objective." "And this one?" she asked. "No objective," he said. "Just a break." Jada nodded slowly, as if accepting that answer at face value. "What's that like for you?" she asked. "What? Taking a break without turning it into a meeting?" Roger thought about it. Unfamiliar, uncomfortable? Not exactly, he admitted, just inefficient. That made her smile. "You measure everything in productivity, don't you?" "Most things." "And the things you can't measure?" He met her gaze. "I usually avoid them." The honesty surprised even him. Jada didn't react with judgment. "Sounds exhausting," she said softly. Roger shrugged, though the movement carried less confidence than usual. "It works." "For business," she replied. "Does it work for life?" The question lingered between them. Outside, a car passed slowly, tires humming against the road. Someone entered the bookstore next door, the bell above the door chiming faintly. Roger looked down at his coffee, then back at her. "I don't spend much time thinking about that difference." "Most people don't," Jada said, "until something forces them to." He studied her expression, calm, steady, unafraid of silence. In most conversations, people rushed to fill gaps with words. Here, the quiet felt intentional. "So why accounting?" he asked, shifting the focus slightly. "Predictable outcomes," she replied. "If the numbers are right, things make sense." "That's familiar." "But," she added, "people aren't spreadsheets." "No," Roger said, "they're risk." Or, she countered gently, "their connection." The word hung there, simple, unembellished. Roger didn't argue, didn't agree either. He just let it exist between them. After a moment, Jada glanced at the clock on the wall. "My break's almost over." Roger nodded. "Mine too." They stood at the same time, an unspoken understanding that the conversation had reached its natural end. As they walked toward the door, Jada said, "You're quieter out here." "Less to manage," he replied. She opened the door, stepping back to let him pass first. On the sidewalk, the late afternoon air carried a mild warmth, traffic moving steadily past. Jada turned toward the hotel entrance. "Thank you for the coffee," she said. Roger inclined his head slightly. "Thank you for not turning it into an interview." That earned a small laugh from her. "I'll try to keep future conversations equally unproductive," she said lightly. "I might start scheduling more of those," he replied. For a brief second, they stood there. No rush, no formal goodbye required. Then Jada headed back inside. Roger remained on the sidewalk a moment longer than necessary. Different. No negotiations, no expectations, no one trying to gain advantage, just conversation. As he finally turned toward his waiting car, one realization surfaced quietly. For the first time in years, time spent without a clear outcome hadn't felt wasted. It had felt steady. And that small shift, barely noticeable on the surface, was the moment status stepped aside, allowing something far more personal to take its place. After the coffee, nothing dramatic changed. No sudden declarations, no shift in how they addressed each other, no moment that could be pointed to and labeled as the beginning. Instead, things moved the way most real connections do, quietly. Roger continued visiting the hotel, but now there was no need to disguise the reason even to himself. The inspection still happened. Reports were still reviewed. Meetings still filled most of his calendar. Yet somewhere between those obligations he began leaving small pockets of time unassigned. Time that somehow aligned with Jada's shifts. Their conversations remained appropriate, never crossing into anything that would make either of them uncomfortable at work. But the tone had changed. It was warmer, more relaxed. Roger approached the desk while Jada was finishing a guest request. When she looked up, her expression carried recognition that went beyond formality. "Busy day?" she asked. "Always," he replied. "Yours?" "Steady," she said, which usually means something will go wrong in about an hour. Roger allowed a faint smile. "That's a very specific prediction." "Experience," she said. He stayed a moment longer than necessary, not speaking, just present. The silence didn't demand to be filled. It simply existed between them, easy, unforced. That was new for him. In most professional spaces, silence suggested uncertainty or lack of preparation. Here it felt like breathing room. Over the next few weeks, these small exchanges became part of both their routines. Roger would arrive, sometimes with a question about operations, sometimes with none at all. Jada would answer when needed, then allow the conversation to drift naturally. One evening, rain tapped softly against the glass doors of the lobby. The outside world looked muted, traffic slower than usual. Roger stood near the desk, watching droplets slide down the windows. "I used to hate weather delays," he said. "Used to?" Jada asked. "They interrupt schedules. And now?" He considered the question. "Now I think maybe everything doesn't need to move at the same speed." Jada nodded as if that made sense to her. "Rain forces people to pause," she said. "Sometimes that's useful." Another quiet moment followed. Not awkward, just shared. There were days when their interaction lasted less than a minute. Simple greetings, a brief update about occupancy, then he moved on. Other days it stretched longer. One late afternoon, the lobby was nearly empty. Roger rested his hand against the counter. "You ever get tired of dealing with people all day?" he asked. "Sometimes," Jada admitted. "But most people aren't difficult, they're just stressed." "That's a generous interpretation." "It's practical," she said. "If I assume the worst, my day gets heavier." Roger absorbed that. In his world, expecting the worst was considered strategic. Here it sounded unnecessary. Weeks passed. Without discussion, their timing adjusted around each other. Roger found himself rearranging non-urgent meetings. Jada noticed he often appeared near the end of her shift. Neither mentioned it. There was comfort in leaving certain things unspoken. One evening, as the sun dipped low enough to cast warm light through the lobby windows, Roger approached just as Jada finished logging the last check-in of the hour. "You look less tired today," he said. "I slept more than 4 hours," she replied. "That counts as rest?" "It counts as progress." He studied her for a moment. "You measure progress differently than most people I know." "I measure what's realistic," she said. The honesty in her tone carried no defensiveness, just acceptance. Another day, he arrived to find her reviewing notes between guests. "Class going well?" he asked. "Challenging," she said, "but manageable. You don't seem like someone who quits easily." "I can't afford to," she replied. There it was again, that quiet determination shaped by responsibility rather than ambition. Roger noticed how often her choices were guided by necessity, not preference. It grounded him. Some conversations were lighter. Once, after a guest struggled with the self-checkout kiosk, Roger said, "Technology was supposed to make things easier." "It does," Jada replied, "until it doesn't." That earned a rare, genuine chuckle from him. Moments like that began appearing more often, small, almost invisible shifts in his usual seriousness. The biggest change, though, wasn't what they said. It was what they didn't feel the need to say. There were evenings when Roger stood at the desk while Jada completed paperwork, neither speaking for nearly a full minute. No tension, no pressure to entertain, just quiet presence. For someone whose life had been defined by constant movement, that stillness felt unfamiliar, and strangely welcome. Jada noticed it too. "You're not in a rush," she said one evening. "I usually am. What's different here?" Roger glanced around the calm lobby. "For a few minutes," he said. "Nothing is demanding something from me." As weeks turned, he explained. "That's rare," she said. "Yes," he admitted. "It is." As weeks turned into months, those brief pockets of calm began influencing the rest of his day. He interrupted fewer people in meetings, listened longer before responding, left the office earlier once or twice without feeling like something would collapse without him. Subtle changes, small enough that no one in his corporate world commented on them, but noticeable to him, and without realizing it, to her as well. One evening, as Roger prepared to leave, Jada said lightly, "You know, you're different from the first day you walked in here." He paused. "How? You look less guarded." The same observation she had made at the cafe, but now it carried more certainty. Roger considered arguing. Instead, he asked, "That a bad thing?" Jada shook her head. "I think it means you're breathing a little." He let out a quiet breath, almost amused. "I didn't realize I'd stopped." "Most people don't," she said. Roger nodded once, then turned toward the exit. As he stepped outside into the evening air, he recognized something he hadn't expected to find in a hotel lobby. Not excitement, not distraction, not escape, stability. And for a man whose life had always moved at full speed, that quiet, steady connection was becoming something he looked forward to more than any meeting on his calendar. Neither of them called it anything yet, but the distance between polite acquaintance and genuine attachment had already begun to fade, one calm conversation at a time. The evening had been long but unusually quiet. Most guests had already checked in, and the lobby carried that late-hour calm where footsteps sounded softer and conversations dropped to near whispers. Outside, the city lights had begun to glow, reflecting faintly against the glass entrance. Roger arrived later than usual. No assistant, no visible urgency. Jada noticed the difference immediately. "You're here past your usual inspection window," she said. "Couldn't sleep," he replied simply. That wasn't an answer he normally offered anyone. She studied his expression for a second. "You look tired." "Just quiet," he corrected. There was a pause, then he nodded toward the elevator. "Is the rooftop still open?" Jada glanced at the clock. "It should be. Why?" Roger hesitated. Rare for him. "Thought I'd get some air." She considered the nearly empty lobby, then the stack of completed tasks in front of her. "My shift ends in 5 minutes," she said. "I can wait." And he did. No pacing, no checking his phone every few seconds, just standing near the desk, hands relaxed at his sides. When Jada finished logging the last entry, she gathered her bag and joined him at the elevator. They rode up in comfortable silence. The rooftop was quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists high above traffic noise. City lights stretched across the distance, windows glowing like scattered constellations. A soft breeze moved through the space, carrying the faint scent of rain from somewhere far off. Jada stepped toward the railing. "It's different up here at night," she said. "How?" "Everything looks slower." Roger rested his hands against the cool metal edge. "Or maybe it just feels that way because you're finally still." She glanced at him. "You're getting good at slowing down." "I'm getting used to it," he admitted. Below them, a line of headlights moved steadily along the avenue. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't empty, it was shared. After a moment, Jada asked quietly, "You ever wish you could go back before life became complicated?" Roger let out a slow breath. "I don't remember when it wasn't. That sounds exhausting." "It was normal," he said. "Complication meant progress. And now?" He thought about that longer than expected. "Now I'm not sure progress is supposed to feel like constant pressure." Jada nodded, leaning slightly against the railing. "You can choose different," she said. Roger turned toward her. "Can you?" "Yes," she replied. "Maybe not everything, but enough to change how it feels." The honesty in her voice carried no attempt to persuade, just quiet belief. For the first time, Roger looked at her without the usual filters, without titles, without the invisible lines that separated their worlds. Not an employee, not someone passing through his day, just the person who, somehow, had become the calmest part of it. "You make things feel slower," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "That a bad thing?" He shook his head. "It's the first time my life hasn't felt like a race." The words surprised him as much as they did her. A soft breeze moved between them, lifting a strand of her hair before it settled again. Neither stepped back. Neither filled the space with more conversation. Their hands rested on the railing, close enough that their fingers brushed. Light, accidental, both noticed. Neither pulled away immediately. Jada's voice dropped softer. "You're different up here," she said. "How? You're not carrying the whole world on your shoulders." Roger let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like relief. "Maybe I got tired of holding it." Their eyes met, and this time neither looked away. There was no rush, no dramatic music swelling, just a moment stretching longer than expected. Roger reached for her hand, slowly, giving her time to move if she wanted to. She didn't. Her fingers settled into his, warm, steady. For a man who controlled every major decision in his life, that simple contact felt strangely significant. "You're not what I planned," he admitted. "I'm not something to plan," Jada said gently. "I'm starting to realize that." Another quiet second passed, the city humming far below them. Roger stepped a little closer. The distance between them narrowed, not urgent, not impulsive. Intentional. Their first kiss was soft, careful, more promise than passion, the kind that asked a question instead of demanding an answer. When they pulled back, neither spoke immediately. Jada searched his expression, as if making sure the moment hadn't been a mistake. Roger's usual guarded composure was still there, but thinner now, like a door left slightly open. "That complicates things," he said quietly. "Life was already complicated," she replied. A faint smile touched his lips. "Fair point." They stayed on the rooftop a little longer, not talking much, just standing side by side as the night deepened around them. Nothing dramatic had happened, no declarations, no promises. Yet both of them understood something had shifted. The distance that once defined their interactions, status, circumstance, caution, had quietly closed. And for the first time in years, Roger Conroy walked away from a moment not calculating consequences, but feeling them. For a while their connection existed in a quiet space that felt separate from everything else. Conversations at the front desk, occasional coffee, late evenings where neither of them felt the need to rush away. Nothing public, nothing announced. But privacy has a short lifespan around people whose names appear in business headlines. It started with something small. One morning as Roger stepped out of his car near the hotel entrance, he noticed a camera across the street. Not unusual by itself. Downtown always had movement. But the lens stayed fixed on him longer than necessary. He ignored it. By afternoon, his assistant knocked lightly on his office door. "There's a short article circulating online," she said carefully. "Nothing major, just speculation." "About what?" She hesitated. "Your recent visits to the downtown property." Roger leaned back in his chair. "That's hardly news." "There's a photo," she added. "You and one of the staff members leaving the cafe across the street." He didn't react immediately. "Is it inaccurate?" "No," she admitted. "Just framed in a way that suggests a personal interest." Roger exhaled slowly. Media attention was part of his world. Usually it focused on acquisitions, partnerships, market moves. Not this. "Let it pass," he said. "It will." Most small stories did. But this one didn't disappear as quickly as expected. Within a few days, another blog picked it up. Then a local business column mentioned it in a short paragraph. Nothing dramatic, just enough to invite curiosity. Questions began appearing in subtle ways. At a board meeting, one of the older members cleared his throat before speaking. "Roger, we've noticed your increased presence at the downtown property." "It's one of our highest performing locations," Roger replied calmly. "Of course," the man said. "We simply want to ensure distractions aren't affecting priorities." The word hung there, polite but pointed. Roger's expression remained neutral. "My priorities are unchanged." No one pushed further, but the message had been delivered. Later that week, another colleague approached him privately after a meeting. "You know how quickly narratives form," she said. "Investors read into everything." "I'm aware. Optics matter," she added gently. "Optics, reputation, perception, control." The familiar language of his world. For years, Roger had navigated those pressures without effort. Personal life stayed invisible, Professional image remained precise. Now the two were beginning to overlap. At the hotel, Jada noticed the shift almost immediately. Guests who normally passed the desk without interest began lingering slightly longer. A few asked casual questions about management. One even joked, "So, do we get special treatment if we become friends with the owner too?" Jada handled it with her usual calm. "No special treatment," she replied politely. "Just good service." But the tone around her had changed, curiosity where there used to be indifference. Later that evening, Roger stopped by as usual. The lobby was quieter than expected, yet the air felt tighter. Jada met his eyes briefly, then looked down at the paperwork in front of her. "You've been popular online," she said, keeping her voice low. "So I've heard. Is that a problem for you?" Roger considered the question. Not normally. And now? He didn't answer immediately, because this time the attention wasn't about business. It was about her. "That depends," he said finally, "on how much noise it creates." Jada nodded, absorbing that without reaction. "I don't want to cause trouble for you," she said. "You're not," he replied quickly. But even as he said it, both of them understood the situation had shifted. Outside forces had entered something that had grown quietly. A few days later, Roger walked into a strategy meeting to find two executives already discussing the articles. One of them stopped mid-sentence when he noticed Roger. "We were just—" "I know," Roger said evenly, "and it's irrelevant to the quarter's projections." The room went silent. He moved straight into the agenda, voice controlled, precise as always. Yet beneath that composure, something unfamiliar pressed at the edges of his thoughts. Not anger, concern, not about reputation alone, but about how easily public opinion could reach into spaces he hadn't intended to expose. That evening, he stood alone in his penthouse, city lights stretching across the glass walls. Normally, external pressure sharpened his focus. This time, it complicated something he hadn't fully defined yet. Connection had never been part of his strategic planning. Now it was colliding with a world that demanded predictability. The next time he saw Jada, the lobby was calm, but the space between them carried unspoken awareness. "This might get louder before it fades," he said. "I figured," she replied. "Does that bother you?" Jada thought for a moment. "I've dealt with harder things than curious strangers." Her steadiness grounded him again. Still, pressure has a way of building even when no one raises their voice. In the weeks that followed, articles slowed, but conversations in boardrooms didn't. Subtle reminders continued. Protect the brand. Maintain image. Avoid unnecessary risk. For the first time, Roger found himself facing a conflict his usual strategies couldn't resolve cleanly. One path protected reputation, the other protected something far more personal, and though he hadn't admitted it out loud, not even to himself, the quiet connection that once felt simple was now standing directly in the path of his carefully controlled world. Pressure rarely announces its peak. It rises gradually, tightening decisions until one moment demands a choice. That moment was closer than either of them realized. The conversation didn't happen during a dramatic storm or in the middle of a public scene. It happened on a quiet evening inside Roger's penthouse, high above the city, where everything usually felt controlled, distant, manageable. Jada stood near the window, hands loosely clasped in front of her. Roger had just ended a call, placing his phone face down on the glass table. His attention shifted fully to her, sensing the seriousness in her posture. "You said you needed to talk," he said. "I do." Her voice was calm, but not casual. That alone was enough to put him on alert. Roger had learned to read tone the way others read numbers. Something about hers carried weight. He stepped a little closer. "What's wrong?" Jada took a slow breath, not to dramatize the moment, but to steady it. "I went to the doctor this morning." Roger waited. No interruption, no assumptions. "I'm pregnant," she said. The words settled into the room without echo. For a second, nothing moved. The city lights outside continued their quiet glow, cars flowing through streets far below, completely unaware that two lives had just shifted direction. Roger's mind reacted before his emotions could catch up. Pregnant. His first instinct wasn't joy, it was calculation, timeline, media, board reaction, reputation, control. The familiar mental systems that had protected him for years activated instantly. He turned slightly, pacing once, just a step, but enough to create distance. Jada watched him, not pleading, not filling the silence, just waiting. "How certain?" he asked. "Very," she replied. "They confirmed it twice." Another pause. Roger's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in the strain of processing something that didn't fit inside his usual structures. This wasn't a contract he could renegotiate. This wasn't a risk he could transfer. It was permanent, unplanned, uncontrolled. Wasn't expecting this. he said quietly. Neither was I, Jada answered. Her tone carried no accusation, just truth. That made it harder. Roger ran a hand across the back of his neck, a rare sign of unease. What are you thinking? He asked. Jada met his gaze. I'm thinking this is real, she said, and it matters. The simplicity of her words pressed against the wall of logic he was trying to build. His mind jumped ahead, to headlines, investor calls, whispered conversations in boardrooms. Fear rarely announced itself clearly in Roger's life. It disguised itself as practicality, as caution, as timing. This complicates things, he said. Life is already complicated, Jada replied softly. He exhaled sharper this time. You don't understand how this looks. I understand what it is, she said. The difference between those two statements filled the space between them. Roger's voice hardened, not loud but defensive. I've spent years building stability. One mistake can shift public perception overnight. Jada's expression changed slightly. Not anger, not shock. Hurt. I never asked for your reputation, she said. I asked for you. The sentence landed deeper than anything else she had said. For a moment, Roger almost stepped back toward her. Almost. But fear spoke louder. Fear of losing control. Fear of unpredictable consequences. Fear of a future he hadn't planned. His next words came out sharper than he intended. I'll never marry you, he said. And I'm not ready to accept this baby. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Jada didn't raise her voice, didn't cry immediately. She simply stood there, absorbing the impact. The distance between them, once small enough to close with a single step, now felt impossible. I never asked for your money, she said quietly. I only asked for you. Roger said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because every possible response required vulnerability he wasn't ready to show. Silence can be louder than rejection, and in that moment, it said everything. Jada nodded once, as if confirming something to herself. Okay, she whispered. No accusations, no dramatic exit. She picked up her bag from the chair. Roger watched, a part of him expecting her to argue, to demand, to push. She didn't. At the door she paused briefly, not turning around. I hope one day you understand what you're afraid of, she said. Then she left. The soft click of the door closing echoed through the penthouse. Roger remained where he stood, staring at the empty space she had occupied seconds earlier. The room looked exactly the same. Glass walls, city lights, perfect order. Yet something inside it had shifted. For the first time in years, control hadn't protected him. It had cost him. He walked to the window, looking down at the distant traffic. His reflection stared back, composed, successful, untouchable. But beneath that surface, a quiet realization began to form. He had just made a decision driven entirely by fear, and called it logic. The problem with decisions made in fear is that they don't feel wrong immediately. They feel necessary. It's only later, when the silence settles in, that the weight of what was lost becomes impossible to ignore. That night, Roger Conroy stood alone in a penthouse built for two, and for the first time, the space felt larger than it ever had before. The first thing Roger noticed after she left was the quiet. Not the usual quiet he was used to, the controlled, comfortable kind that came with living alone. This was different, heavier. The door had barely finished closing when the penthouse seemed to expand around him, every open space suddenly too wide, too empty. For a long moment, he didn't move. He stood where she had left him, staring at the spot near the window as if the conversation might somehow rewind if he stayed still long enough. It didn't. Eventually, he walked back to the table and picked up his phone. No missed calls, no urgent messages. The world outside his apartment continued exactly as it always had, which somehow made the silence inside feel even louder. He told himself he had done the practical thing, protected his reputation, avoided a situation he wasn't prepared for, maintained control. The logic lined up perfectly, yet none of it settled the tight pressure in his chest. That night he tried to return to routine. Laptop open, financial reports on the screen, numbers moving in neat, predictable patterns. Normally this was where he felt most comfortable, where outcomes made sense, but the columns blurred sooner than usual. His attention drifted back to the last thing she had said. Never asked for your money, I only asked for you. Roger closed the laptop. The room felt too quiet for concentration. He poured himself a glass of water, took a sip, then set it down untouched. Sleep didn't come easily. When it finally did, it was shallow, broken by thoughts he couldn't fully silence. The next morning he woke before his alarm, the skyline still dim with early light. For a moment he expected to hear movement in the kitchen, the soft sound of someone else in the space. The apartment remained still. Roger exhaled slowly, pushing the thought aside. Routine would fix this. Routine always did. At the office, his schedule was packed back-to-back meetings designed to leave no space for distraction. He moved through them with his usual efficiency. Questions answered, decisions made, numbers reviewed. To anyone watching, nothing had changed. But small signs slipped through. He asked people to repeat information he would normally catch the first time. Paused longer before responding. Once, halfway through a presentation, he realized he hadn't heard the last 30 seconds. "Continue," he said, masking the lapse with a nod. By afternoon, the familiar rhythm of work had returned, but the sense of satisfaction that usually followed productivity didn't. It felt flat. That evening, his driver asked, "Home, sir?" Roger hesitated. For a split second, the word hotel surfaced in his mind. He pushed it away. "Home," he confirmed. Days passed, then a week. Roger didn't visit the downtown property. No inspections, no unscheduled stops. On paper, it made sense. Distance reduced attention. Attention reduced speculation. In reality, the absence left a gap in his routine he hadn't expected. He filled it with more work, later hours, additional meetings, new investment reviews. The strategy was familiar, replaced discomfort with productivity. Yet small reminders kept slipping through. A quiet lobby in another building, someone laughing in a hallway, a phrase overheard that echoed something she once said. Each time the memory surfaced uninvited. One evening, while sorting through paperwork at home, Roger opened a drawer he rarely used. Inside sat a plain disposable coffee cup. He recognized it immediately, the one from the cafe across the street. He had kept it without thinking, dropping it there weeks earlier after returning from that first break. Roger picked it up, turning it slowly in his hand. It was nothing, just cardboard and a printed logo, yet it carried the memory of 15 minutes where no one expected anything from him. He set it back in the drawer and closed it carefully. The apartment felt even quieter afterward. At work, his colleagues noticed subtle changes, though no one addressed them directly. Roger left meetings earlier than usual once or twice, skipped a networking event he would normally attend without hesitation. When asked if everything was all right, he gave the same calm answer. Just adjusting priorities. It sounded reasonable. It wasn't entirely untrue. But it wasn't the full story either. Late one night, long after the city had settled into its slower rhythm, Roger stood in the living room overlooking the skyline. The view was as impressive as ever. Lights stretching across the distance, movement continuing in endless patterns. For years, that view had felt like proof of what he had built. Tonight, it felt distant, detached. Success was still there, control was still intact. Yet something essential was missing, and no amount of planning could restore it. Roger rested his hand against the glass, watching his reflection overlap with the city beyond. For the first time, he allowed a thought he had been avoiding. He hadn't just ended a conversation. He had pushed away the one person who had made his life feel less like a race. The realization didn't arrive with drama, just a quiet, steady weight settling into place. Some decisions feel correct in the moment because they protect you from immediate risk. But protection can come at a cost that isn't obvious until the noise fades. Standing alone in the stillness of his penthouse, Roger began to understand something he had spent years avoiding. Control could prevent loss, but it could also create it. And now, with the space around him echoing more than ever, he was left with the one consequence no strategy could erase: silence where connection used to be. Time didn't stop after that night. It never does. Within days, Roger's schedule filled itself again: meetings, site visits, investor calls, negotiations that demanded quick decisions and steady confidence. From the outside, his life looked exactly as it had before: efficient, structured, productive. Inside, something had shifted. At first, the change was subtle, easy to ignore if he kept moving fast enough. He stayed later at the office, adding extra reviews to his evenings. New opportunities appeared, and he accepted them without hesitation. Expanding a property portfolio required focus, and focus was something he had always relied on. Work had been his safest place for years, so he leaned into it. Weeks passed, then months. The articles about his personal life faded, replaced by new headlines about acquisitions and quarterly growth. Board members relaxed. Investors remained confident. On paper, everything was stable. Yet stability felt different now. One evening, after a long strategy session, Roger returned to his penthouse earlier than usual. The city outside buzzed with the usual motion, traffic flowing, lights shifting, distant movement that never fully slept. Inside, the apartment was still. He set his keys on the counter and loosened his tie, expecting the familiar sense of relief that usually came with closing the door on the day. It didn't arrive. Instead, the quiet pressed in. Roger moved through the space without purpose, past the kitchen, across the living room, toward the desk where unfinished documents waited. He sat, opened a file, read the first page twice without absorbing a word, then closed it again. His attention drifted, not to a specific memory at first, just a feeling that something important had been left unresolved. He stood and walked toward the hallway, stopping near the small side table where unopened mail had begun to collect. On top of the stack sat a receipt from months earlier, the cafe across from the hotel. Roger picked it up, turning the thin paper between his fingers. It should have meant nothing. Yet the memory surfaced immediately. 2 cups, a quiet table, a conversation without objectives. He placed the receipt back down and exhaled slowly. For years, success had felt energizing. Now it felt muted. As the months moved forward, Roger's routine became even more disciplined. Morning workouts grew longer, meetings became tighter, decisions quicker, efficiency filled every available space. Colleagues praised his focus. "You've been sharper than ever lately," one executive commented after a negotiation closed ahead of schedule. Roger nodded politely. What no one saw was the reason behind the intensity. Stillness had become uncomfortable. Whenever his schedule cleared unexpectedly, his mind drifted to places he wasn't ready to revisit, so he kept moving. Late one night, after reviewing financial projections, Roger walked into the kitchen for water and noticed something near the edge of the counter. A mug, plain white. He remembered it instantly. Jada had used it once during a late evening when he had brought coffee upstairs after a long day. He hadn't moved it since. Roger picked it up, turning it slowly in his hand. Such a small object. Yet it carried the echo of an ordinary moment. Nothing dramatic, just quiet company. He set it back exactly where it had been. The apartment felt larger afterward. At work, his assistant began scheduling fewer evening engagements, assuming he preferred the extra time. Roger didn't correct her, but he didn't use the time to rest either. Instead, he reviewed reports that could have waited, answered emails that weren't urgent. Anything to avoid the stillness that followed when there was nothing left to manage. One afternoon, during a board discussion about long-term expansion, a member joked, "You're building an empire at this pace, Roger." The room chuckled lightly. Roger gave a measured smile. Inside, the word empire felt strangely hollow. Empires were impressive, but they didn't sit across from you at the end of the day. As the 9th month approached, though he wasn't consciously counting, something else began to change. The memories stopped arriving as sharp flashes. Instead, they settled into a steady presence, a laugh in a quiet lobby, a calm voice saying, "I can't afford to panic," a rooftop where the city looked slower than usual, none of it dramatic, just persistent. One evening, Roger found himself standing at the window again, watching traffic move far below. For years, that view had symbolized achievement. Now it felt distant, like observing someone else's life from behind glass. He rested his hand against the cool surface, thinking about a truth he had avoided since that night. He hadn't just walked away from a difficult situation. He had walked away from the only part of his life that had made success feel shared. The realization didn't come with panic, just clarity. Work could fill time. It couldn't replace presence. Around that same period, small shifts appeared in his behavior. He began ending meetings earlier when discussions drifted into unnecessary detail, ignored a few non-essential networking invitations. Once, during dinner with investors, he silenced his phone instead of keeping it face up on the table. Tiny decisions, but each one reflected a change he hadn't fully acknowledged yet. Priorities were adjusting, quietly, without announcement. On a particularly still night, Roger opened the drawer where he had once placed that disposable coffee cup. It was still there, untouched. He held it for a moment, then set it back again. Not out of nostalgia, out of recognition. Some moments, no matter how small, mark a line between who you were and who you're becoming. By the end of those 9 months, Roger's life looked stronger than ever from the outside. Profits up, reputation intact, control fully restored. Yet beneath that surface, something essential had changed. Success no longer felt like a finish line. It felt incomplete. And though he hadn't said it out loud, not to his team, not to himself, one quiet truth had settled in during the long stretch of distance. The silence he had chosen to protect his life had become the loudest thing in it. The message came on an ordinary morning. Nothing about the day suggested it would be different from any other. Roger was halfway through a quarterly review meeting, seated at the head of the long glass table in conference room A. Charts filled the screen. Revenue projections, expansion timelines, performance summaries delivered in calm, practiced voices. He listened, nodding occasionally, asking precise questions when numbers didn't align. Everything was moving exactly as planned. His phone, set face down beside his notebook, vibrated once. Normally, he ignored notifications during meetings unless they came from a very short list of contacts. The phone vibrated again, short, insistent. Roger glanced at the screen. The message was from the manager of the downtown hotel. Brief, direct. Jada Rao was admitted to St. Mary's Hospital this morning. For a second, the words didn't fully register. Then they did. The room continued around him, someone still speaking about occupancy trends, but the sound seemed to pull farther away, like it was happening at the end of a long hallway. Roger read the message again. Admitted. Hospital. Morning. His chest tightened, not sharp panic but a sudden drop in certainty. One of the executives across the table paused mid-sentence. Roger? He didn't answer immediately. His mind, so reliable in high-pressure situations, struggled to find its usual structure. 9 months. The number surfaced without effort. Another vibration followed. A second message. She's in labor. That was the moment everything else lost importance. Roger stood. Chairs shifted slightly as the room adjusted to the unexpected movement. Continue without me, he said, voice steady but quieter than usual. One of the board members frowned. We still need your approval on... You have my approval, Roger replied, already reaching for his jacket. No explanation, no additional context. For the first time in years, he left a meeting mid-discussion. The hallway outside felt too narrow. Roger moved faster than usual, his normally measured pace replaced by something closer to urgency. His assistant hurried to keep up. Is everything all right? He didn't slow. I need the car ready now. Yes, sir. Closed. The silence inside the small space pressed in. Roger stared at his reflection in the mirrored wall, composed suit, controlled expression, but his eyes gave him away. There was uncertainty there, something he rarely allowed. As the elevator descended, a thought surfaced, uninvited and impossible to dismiss. What if I'm too late? The doors opened. He stepped out immediately. The city outside was mid-morning busy, traffic moving in steady lines, pedestrians crossing with coffee cups in hand, life continuing without pause. Roger slid into the back seat of the car. St. Mary's Hospital, he said. The driver nodded and pulled into traffic. For the first few minutes, Roger said nothing. His phone rested in his hand, screen dark. Normally, he would have used the drive to return calls, confirm schedules, handle pending decisions. Now, none of it mattered. His mind replayed the last conversation in the penthouse. I never asked for your money. I only asked for you. The memory landed harder than it had months earlier, because this time there was no distance left to hide behind. The car stopped at a red light. Roger looked out the window, barely seeing the storefronts passing by. Another thought pressed forward, quieter but heavier. She went through all of this without me. No strategy could soften that truth. The light changed. The car moved again. Roger leaned back slightly, exhaling through tension he hadn't noticed building in his shoulders. For years he had believed timing could always be managed. Deals delayed, decisions postponed, conversations scheduled when convenient. Life didn't follow those rules. Some moments arrived whether you were ready or not. When the hospital building finally came into view, something inside him shifted from uncertainty to clarity. This wasn't about reputation, not about optics, not about control. It was about showing up, even if he was late. The car pulled to a stop near the entrance. Before the driver could step out, Roger had already opened the door. Wait here, he said. Yes, sir. Roger stepped onto the curb, the cool air hitting his face. For a brief second he stood still, taking in the automatic doors, the steady flow of people entering and leaving, the quiet urgency that seemed to surround places like this. Hospitals had a way of stripping life down to what actually mattered. No titles, no negotiations, no advantage in confidence, just moments that couldn't be rescheduled. Roger walked inside. The scent of antiseptic and polished floors greeted him immediately. At the reception desk, a nurse looked up. Can I help you? He swallowed once before answering. I'm looking for Jada Rao. She checked her screen. Second floor, maternity wing. Roger nodded. Thank you. As he turned toward the elevators, one realization settled fully into place. 9 months ago, he had walked away from responsibility because he was afraid of what it would change. Now, standing in a hospital corridor, he understood something with quiet certainty. Whatever waited behind that next door was already part of his life. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Roger stepped out onto the second floor and was immediately met by a quieter kind of atmosphere than the busy lobby below. The hallway stretched ahead in clean lines, voices lowered out of habit, footsteps softened by polished floors. Hospitals carried a different rhythm. No one moved casually. Every person walking those corridors had somewhere specific to be, someone to see, news to receive, a moment waiting that couldn't be postponed. Roger paused just long enough to read the sign mounted on the wall. Maternity wing. His chest tightened, not sharply, but enough to make his next breath slower. For years he had entered buildings with certainty. Offices, conference halls, negotiation rooms, places where preparation gave him advantage. This place offered none. He began walking. Each step felt heavier than it should have. Nurses passed occasionally, their conversations quiet and efficient. A distant monitor beeped somewhere behind closed doors. The scent of disinfectant lingered in the air. Ordinary details, yet every sound seemed amplified against the silence in his mind. As he turned the corner into the main corridor, a faint cry echoed from somewhere ahead. Small, new, unmistakable. Roger stopped without meaning to. The sound lasted only a moment before fading, but it settled into his chest with unexpected force. For months, the reality of the situation had existed mostly as thought, abstract, distant enough to ignore when work demanded attention. Here, it was no longer abstract. It was real, alive. He continued forward, slower now. Doors lined both sides of the hallway, some closed, some slightly open. Inside, glimpses of quiet movement, family members speaking softly, nurses adjusting equipment, moments of relief and exhaustion sharing the same space. Roger's reflection followed him in the glass panels along the wall. Same tailored suit, same composed posture. Yet something about the way he moved had changed. Less certainty, more hesitation. He checked the room numbers as he walked, matching them to the one the nurse had given him. With each step, memories surfaced, uninvited but impossible to stop. A rooftop under city lights. A calm voice saying, "You can choose different." A door closing behind her months ago. He slowed again. For the first time in years, Roger realized he was afraid. Not of failure, not of public perception. Afraid of what waited on the other side of a simple hospital door. What if she didn't want to see him? What if he had arrived too late to matter? The questions pressed in, unfamiliar and uncomfortable. He reached the final stretch of the corridor. Halfway down, one door stood slightly open. From inside came the soft rustle of movement, and then another sound. A newborn's cry. Clearer this time, fragile, insistent. Roger's chest tightened. He stopped a few steps away. His hand lifted slightly, then lowered again. For years he had built a life where hesitation was considered weakness. Decisions were made quickly, confidently, without second-guessing. Now, standing in that quiet hallway, he understood something he had never learned in any boardroom. Some doors carry more weight than any contract. He took one more step forward, then another, until he stood just outside the room. Through the narrow opening he could see only a portion of the space. A pale wall, the edge of a chair, a soft movement he couldn't fully make out. The newborn cried again, softer this time, as if settling. Roger's hand rose toward the door. It trembled. A small, involuntary movement he couldn't control. He stared at his fingers, almost surprised by them. This was the same hand that had signed acquisitions worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. Yet now it hovered inches from a simple handle, unsure. A quiet realization moved through him, steady and undeniable. 9 months ago, he had believed responsibility would trap him. Standing here, he understood something different. Responsibility wasn't the weight he feared. Regret was. Roger inhaled slowly, steadying himself. The hallway behind him remained calm, distant sounds continuing their soft rhythm. No one was watching, no one judging. Just a man in a moment he could no longer postpone. He placed his hand on the door. For a second he closed his eyes, just long enough to let the last of his resistance fall away. Then, with a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, Roger Conroy pushed the door open. The door opened with a soft, careful push. Roger stepped inside slowly, as if any sudden movement might disturb something fragile. The room was quiet, dim but warm, filled with that gentle stillness that follows long hours of effort and relief. A monitor hummed softly near the wall. Curtains were half drawn, letting in a muted wash of afternoon light. For a brief second he didn't move. His eyes adjusted first, then he saw her. Jada lay against the raised hospital bed, exhaustion visible in the relaxed heaviness of her shoulders. Strands of hair had slipped loose around her face, and yet there was a calm in her expression he hadn't seen before. Not the calm of endurance, the calm that comes after something difficult has finally passed. In her arms, wrapped in a small white blanket, was a tiny bundle. Another soft cry filled the space, short, searching. Roger's chest tightened. That sound was different from the hallway. Closer, real. Jada looked up. For a moment, surprise crossed her face. Not shock, not anger, just recognition. Roger slower than usual. He took one careful step forward, then stopped again, unsure how close he was allowed to be. His gaze shifted to the small bundle in her arms. So small, he murmured, almost to himself. Jada adjusted the blanket slightly, revealing a tiny face, eyes closed, features delicate, peaceful in sleep between brief sounds. "That's your daughter," she said softly. The words landed deeper than anything else in the room. Your daughter. Not a possibility, not a discussion, a fact. Roger felt something inside him give way. Not dramatically, not all at once. More like a wall that had held for years, finally losing the strength to stay up. He moved closer, slower than he had ever approached anything in his life. "What's her name?" he asked. "Leora," Jada replied. He repeated it under his breath as if testing how it felt. "Leora." A quiet warmth settled into the space between them. Roger's eyes stayed fixed on the tiny rise and fall of the baby's breathing. For months, his thoughts had been filled with projections, risks, consequences. None of those existed here. Only this moment. "Was afraid," he said, voice low. Jada watched him carefully. "Of what?" Roger hesitated, searching for honesty instead of the usual controlled response. "Caring about something I couldn't control." The admission hung in the air, unpolished, real. Jada's expression softened, not triumphant, not bitter, just understanding. "That's most of life," she said gently. Roger let out a breath that felt like it had been held for months. "May I hold her?" The question came quietly, stripped of pride. Jada studied him for a moment, not testing him, just making sure the sincerity was real. Then she nodded. "Sit." Roger lowered himself carefully into the chair beside the bed. Jada shifted the small bundle toward him, supporting the baby's head with practiced care. When the weight settled into his arms, everything else seemed to fall away. Leora was lighter than he expected, fragile, warm. Her tiny hand moved once against the blanket, fingers curling instinctively. Roger froze, not out of fear of dropping her, but from the sudden awareness of how much trust this moment required. The room went completely still. No boardrooms, no headlines, no expectations. Just a father holding his child for the first time. A tear slipped down before he noticed it. He didn't wipe it away. "I was wrong," he whispered, not to defend himself, not to explain, just to acknowledge it. Jada leaned back against the pillow, watching the shift happen in real time. No dramatic speech, no promises he couldn't keep, just a man who finally allowed himself to feel something he had spent years avoiding. Leora stirred slightly, releasing a soft sound before settling again. Roger adjusted his hold instinctively, careful, attentive. "How do you—" he began. "You'll learn," Jada said quietly. He nodded, eyes still fixed on the tiny face. For the first time since entering the room, his shoulders lowered, tension releasing without effort. "I thought responsibility would take my freedom," he admitted. "And now?" she asked. Roger looked down at the small life resting against him. "It feels like I finally know what to use it for." The words were simple, but they carried more weight than any deal he had ever signed. Jada's eyes softened. No instant forgiveness, no sudden return to what they had been, just recognition that something real had changed. Roger sat there longer than he realized, listening to the quiet rhythm of his daughter's breathing. Every few seconds he glanced up as if confirming the moment wasn't temporary. It wasn't. Nothing in that room could be undone or negotiated, and for the first time in years that didn't terrify him. It steadied him. Because the man who had once walked away out of fear was now sitting in a hospital room, holding the very responsibility he had rejected, and discovering it wasn't a burden, it was meaning. Roger didn't leave the hospital right away. After the first rush of emotion settled into something quieter, he remained in the chair beside the bed, his suit jacket folded over the back, sleeves slightly creased for the first time in years without him noticing. Leora slept again, her small breath steady, the earlier cries replaced by soft, occasional movements beneath the blanket. Jada watched him for a while before speaking. "You don't have to stay," she said gently. "You've probably got 100 things waiting." Roger shook his head. "They can wait." It wasn't a dramatic declaration, just a simple shift in priority that, for him, meant more than any grand statement. Silence returned, but it felt different now. Not distant, shared. After a few minutes, a nurse stepped in quietly to check vitals, offering Roger a polite nod as she adjusted the monitor and made a note on the chart. "You can hold her like that," she said reassuringly. "Just support her neck." Roger nodded, already doing exactly that, as if some instinct had switched on without instruction. When the nurse left, he looked down again at the tiny face resting against his arm. "I should have been here months ago," he said. The sentence carried no defense, only recognition. Jada didn't rush to answer. Trust, once broken, rarely returns with words alone. "Being here now is what matters," she said after a moment. Roger absorbed that quietly. For the first time he understood that rebuilding wasn't about correcting the past. It was about consistency in the present. He stayed until evening, not talking much, just present, standing when the nurse needed space, sitting again when things settled, occasionally asking small practical questions. "Does she need to eat soon? Is that normal? Should the room be warmer?" None of the questions sounded like a man trying to impress. They sounded like someone learning. Before he left that night, he stood beside the bed, unsure how to end the moment. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said. "Not if you want me to. Not if it's okay. Just a quiet commitment." Jada studied his expression, searching for hesitation. There wasn't any. "Okay," she replied. He did come back the next day, earlier than visiting hours. The receptionist at the front desk recognized him from the day before and waved him through with a small, understanding smile. Inside the room, Jada was awake, Leora resting in the bassinet beside the bed. Roger stepped in more comfortably this time, still careful but less unsure of where to stand. "Morning," he said. "Morning." No awkwardness, just a new rhythm forming. He brought coffee, tea for her, black for himself, setting the cups down quietly. "You didn't have to," Jada said. "Wanted to." That difference mattered. Over the next few days, Roger kept showing up, not with grand gestures or expensive gifts, with presence. He handled paperwork at the hospital desk when forms needed signatures, listened carefully when nurses explained routines, asked questions without pretending he already understood. One afternoon, while adjusting the small blanket, he admitted, "I've negotiated billion-dollar deals without losing sleep." Jada glanced at him. "And this?" He exhaled softly. "This is harder. Why? Because this one actually matters." The honesty in his voice left no room for performance. Jada nodded slowly, accepting the truth without commenting further. When discharge day arrived, Roger was there early, not pacing, not checking emails, just waiting. As the nurse reviewed instructions, he listened with the same focus he once reserved for high-stakes meetings. Feeding schedule, sleep patterns, follow-up appointments. Every detail mattered now. As they walked toward the exit, Jada moving carefully, Roger carrying the small bag of essentials, he realized something quietly profound. For years, his life had been defined by expansion. Bigger deals, wider reach, higher numbers. Now his attention centered on something small enough to fit in his arms. And it didn't feel like a loss, it felt precise, grounded. Outside the hospital, the afternoon air carried a mild warmth. Roger opened the car door, then paused. "I know I can't fix everything I said," he said. Jada met his eyes. "No," she agreed. "I'm not going to promise things I don't understand yet. That's probably wise. But I can show up," he continued, "consistently." The words settled between them, not flashy, not emotional, reliable. Jada studied him for a moment, measuring not his tone but his steadiness. "That's what matters," she said. In the weeks that followed, Roger kept that promise. He attended pediatric appointments, sometimes arriving straight from meetings, tie slightly loosened, phone silenced. He learned how to hold Leora without freezing, how to recognize the difference between hunger and discomfort, how to function on less sleep without complaint. None of it came naturally at first, but he didn't retreat when it was difficult. One evening, after a particularly long day, he admitted quietly, "I used to think responsibility would close my life in." Jada adjusted the blanket around their daughter. "And now?" Roger watched Leora's tiny hand curl around his finger. "It opened something I didn't know I was missing." Jada didn't respond with a speech or a sudden emotional shift. She simply nodded, acknowledging the change without rushing ahead of it. Rebuilding didn't happen in one moment. It happened in dozens of small ones, showing up on time, listening instead of defending, choosing presence over convenience. For a man who once measured success in outcomes and numbers, those quiet decisions became the most meaningful work he had ever done. Because this time, there was no contract to secure the result, only trust, earned slowly, one ordinary day at a time. The first few weeks after leaving the hospital didn't come with dramatic changes, no sudden return to what they had once been, no easy labels. Instead, life settled into a rhythm shaped by small responsibilities. Roger showed up when he said he would. At first, Jada treated that consistency like something temporary, appreciated but not fully trusted yet. Experience had taught her that people often meant well in emotional moments, then drifted back to old habits once life became busy again. So she watched, not suspiciously, carefully. Roger adjusted his schedule in ways that surprised even his assistant. Evening meetings were shortened or moved earlier. Non-essential networking events quietly disappeared from his calendar. When conflicts appeared, he chose the option that left space for appointments and visits. One afternoon, his assistant asked gently, "Should I keep Thursday evenings blocked moving forward?" Roger didn't hesitate. Yes. No long explanation. Just a decision that reflected a shift in priority. At Jada's apartment, life was far less polished than Roger's usual environment. The space was modest, clean, organized, practical. A small couch near the wall, a narrow dining table, baby supplies arranged with careful efficiency. The first time he arrived with groceries instead of takeout, Jada raised an eyebrow. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "I'm learning the difference between helpful and impressive." That earned the smallest hint of a smile. Caring for an infant introduced a kind of unpredictability Roger had never managed before. Leora woke at uneven hours. Some nights were calm, others stretched longer than expected. Plans changed without warning. At first, Roger approached it like a problem to solve, tracking feeding times, researching sleep patterns, asking precise questions. Then he realized something. Not everything needed optimization. Sometimes the only requirement was presence. One evening, while pacing the small living room with Leora resting against his shoulder, he said quietly, "I've spent years making sure nothing disrupted my schedule." Jada, half asleep on the couch, replied, "She's going to disrupt all of it." Roger glanced down at the tiny face against him. "I think that might be the point." Trust, however, didn't rebuild just because he tried. There were moments when old wounds surfaced. Once, after he arrived 15 minutes late due to a delayed meeting, Jada's tone cooled slightly. "I wasn't sure you were coming." Roger didn't defend himself with excuses. "You had a reason to think that," he said. No argument, no attempt to erase the past with explanations, just acknowledgement. That mattered more than any apology speech. Over time, his consistency became predictable. If he said he would be there, he was. If he couldn't make something, he informed her early instead of disappearing behind work. Those habits, simple on the surface, slowly replaced the uncertainty he had created months earlier. One night, after putting Leora down, Jada said quietly, "You're different." Roger leaned against the kitchen counter. "I hope so. You don't run when things get inconvenient." "I used to," he admitted. "What changed?" Roger considered the question. "I realized leaving was easier in the moment, but heavier later." Jada nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. At work, the shift didn't go unnoticed. Roger still performed at the same level, decisive, sharp, respected, but his boundaries became clearer. He declined a late dinner with potential partners, suggesting a morning meeting instead. During another negotiation, he paused the discussion when it drifted past the scheduled time. "We'll continue tomorrow," he said calmly. One executive later joked, "Did fatherhood make you more disciplined or less available?" Roger replied without hesitation, "More intentional." The answer ended the conversation. Back at the apartment, progress appeared in small domestic moments. Roger learning how to warm a bottle without checking instructions twice, recognizing which cry meant hunger and which meant discomfort. Standing by the crib longer than necessary just to confirm Leora had settled. None of it dramatic. Yet each action quietly contradicted the man who had once said he wouldn't accept this child. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Jada watched Roger assemble a small piece of baby furniture with focused determination. "You know you could have paid someone to do that," she said. "I could," he agreed. "Then why didn't you?" Roger tightened the final screw, then looked up. "Because I need to learn how to build things that don't come with contracts." The sentence hung in the room, simple but honest. Jada didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. Trust doesn't return in one moment. It returns in patterns, in repeated proof, in quiet reliability that leaves no space for doubt. Weeks turned into months, and the tension that once lingered between them softened, not disappearing entirely, but no longer dominating every interaction. One night, after a long day, Roger admitted, "I used to think strength meant never needing anyone." Jada adjusted the blanket around their daughter. "And now?" He watched Leora's steady breathing. "I think strength is staying when it would be easier to leave." Jada met his eyes, searching for exaggeration. There was none, just calm certainty. Their relationship didn't snap back into romance overnight. Instead, it rebuilt the way strong foundations are formed, layer by layer. Shared responsibilities, honest conversations, silences that no longer carried resentment. Roger stopped trying to fix the past with words. He focused on the present instead. Showing up, helping without being asked, listening without preparing a defense, those choices carried more weight than any promise he could have made. "You know what I trust the most right now?" Roger looked up. "What?" "You're not trying to be perfect," He nodded slowly. "I'm just trying to be here." "That's the first thing I've believed without questioning," she said. For a man who once measured success through expansion and control, the new definition felt surprisingly clear. Not dominance, not reputation. Consistency. Because in the end, trust wasn't rebuilt by grand gestures or emotional speeches. It was rebuilt by the quiet, repeated decision to stay. By the time the first few months settled into a routine, something subtle had changed between them. Not in a dramatic storybook way. There were no sudden declarations, no moment where everything snapped back into place. Instead, the tension that once sat between their conversations had thinned, replaced by something steadier, less fragile. Roger no longer felt like a guest in Jada's space, and Jada no longer watched every promise as if waiting for it to break. Their days began to overlap naturally. Morning messages about appointments, short calls during lunch breaks, evenings that sometimes ended with both of them sitting quietly while Leora slept nearby. Nothing impressive, just shared time. One evening after a long day, Roger arrived later than usual. Traffic had slowed everything, and by the time he stepped inside, the apartment lights were already dim. Jada sat on the couch, a blanket over her shoulders, watching the baby monitor. "You're late," she said, not accusing, just stating a fact. "I know," Roger replied. "I should have left the meeting earlier." He didn't offer a long explanation, just responsibility. Jada nodded, accepting that without pressing further. That was new. Months earlier, silence like that would have carried tension. Now it passed without friction. Roger set his bag down and leaned slightly against the wall. "How was today?" "Quiet," Jada said. "She slept more than usual. That's good." They both looked toward the bassinet at the same time. Small moments like that, shared attention, shared relief, began to replace the distance they once carried. Later that night, as they cleaned up the kitchen, Roger paused. "You still think I was a terrible decision?" he asked lightly. Jada glanced over, a faint smile forming. "I think you were," she said. "And now?" She dried her hand slowly, considering. "Now I think you're trying." Roger nodded once. "That's the only promise I can make." Jada met his eyes. "That's the one I trust." The exchange was simple, almost casual, but it held more weight than any dramatic apology could have. As weeks passed, their conversations shifted from careful to comfortable. They talked about ordinary things, groceries, schedules, small frustrations, quiet victories. Roger found himself sharing parts of his day he would normally keep to himself. A difficult negotiation, a decision he second-guessed, a moment he almost reacted too quickly. Jada listened without trying to fix everything. Sometimes she just said, "That sounds exhausting." And somehow, that was enough. One Sunday afternoon, sunlight filtered softly through the apartment windows. Leora lay on a blanket, kicking her feet in uneven bursts of energy. Roger sat nearby, watching with focused amusement. "She's determined," he said. "She gets that from you," Jada replied. "I thought you said she got patience from you." "She did," Jada said. "The stubborn part is definitely yours." Roger laughed, an easy, unguarded sound that would have surprised anyone who only knew him from boardrooms. Jada noticed. "You laugh more now," she said. "I think I forgot how," he admitted. "Why?" "I was too busy proving I didn't need anything." Jada adjusted the blanket near Leora's feet. "And now?" Roger watched his daughter's small hand close around his finger. "Now I know I was wrong." Their relationship didn't return to the intensity of early attraction. It became something quieter, stronger, less about excitement, more about presence. They sat closer without thinking about it, shared meals without checking the time, reached for the same object at the same moment, and smiled instead of pulling back. Trust had created space for warmth to return naturally. One evening, after putting Leora down, they stood by the window overlooking the street. Cars passed slowly below, headlights tracing steady lines across the pavement. Roger spoke first. "I used to think love was something that distracted people from success." Jada turned slightly toward him. "And now? I think it's the only thing that makes success feel like it belongs to someone." The words weren't rehearsed. They landed with quiet sincerity. Jada didn't respond with a speech. She simply rested her head lightly against his shoulder. No urgency, no need to define the moment. Roger didn't move away. For the first time, closeness didn't feel like risk. It felt earned. As days blended into weeks, their connection settled into something stable enough not to need constant reassurance. There were still disagreements. Small ones about timing, about responsibilities, about how to balance work and rest. But arguments no longer threatened the foundation. They became conversations instead of battles. Roger learned to listen without preparing a defense. Jada learned to express frustration without expecting abandonment. Growth moved in both directions. One quiet night, as they prepared to turn off the lights, Roger said, "I don't know if I deserve how patient you've been." Jada paused. "This wasn't about deserving," she said. "It was about deciding whether change was real. And is it?" She looked at him, not at his words, but at the months behind them. "Yes," she said softly, "it is." Love didn't return with fireworks. It returned the way strong things usually do, gradually, quietly, without needing to announce itself. Not the intense rush of something new, but the steady warmth of something rebuilt with intention. And for Roger, that quiet kind of love felt more valuable than anything he had ever chased before. From the outside, Roger's life still looked the same. The companies were running. The meetings continued. His name still appeared in the same business columns that had followed his rise for years. If anything, his professional reputation had grown stronger. Deals closed cleanly. Projects stayed on schedule. Investors remained confident. But the structure behind his days had quietly changed. Roger no longer filled every available hour. Evenings were blocked off, non-negotiable unless something truly urgent appeared. Calls that once stretched late into the night were pushed to mornings. Dinners that used to happen in quiet, expensive restaurants were replaced with something simpler. Home, not the penthouse alone, but wherever Jada and Leora were. One evening he left the office earlier than usual. An executive caught up with him near the elevators. "We still have a few items to finalize tonight," the man said. Roger checked his watch. "We'll finish them in the morning." "It's time-sensitive." Roger met his eyes calmly. "So is everything else." The doors opened. The conversation ended. Months earlier he would have stayed without hesitation. Now he understood the difference between urgency and habit. At the apartment, the atmosphere was familiar. Soft light, the quiet sounds of a lived-in space, the gentle rhythm of a routine that didn't revolve around profit margins. Leora sat on the floor, surrounded by a small circle of toys she seemed more interested in pushing than playing with. Jada looked up as Roger entered. "You're early." "I planned it," he said. That alone carried meaning. Dinner wasn't elaborate. Simple food, shared at the small table, conversation drifting between practical updates and light observations. Roger found himself talking less about numbers and more about moments. A junior employee who surprised him with initiative. A decision he delayed because it didn't feel necessary to rush. A meeting he ended early because the room had already reached agreement. Efficiency was still there. But it no longer controlled everything. Afterward, Leora pulled herself up using the edge of the couch, wobbling slightly on uncertain legs. Roger froze mid-step. "Is she?" Jada smiled. "She's been trying all afternoon." Leora shifted her weight, one tiny foot sliding forward, then another, a hesitant, unsteady step. Roger instinctively moved closer but stopped himself from interfering. Leora took a second step, awkward but determined, before dropping back down onto the cushion with a soft bounce. The room filled with quiet laughter. Roger knelt beside her, eyes wide with something close to disbelief. "That counts," Jada said. "That absolutely counts," he replied. Leora looked up at him, pleased with herself, as if expecting acknowledgement. Roger laughed, full, unguarded. For a moment, nothing else existed. No deadlines, no strategies, no expectations beyond that tiny victory. Later, as the apartment settled into its evening calm, Jada stood beside him near the window. "What is success now?" she asked quietly. Roger watched their daughter, now half asleep against a pillow. For years, that question would have triggered a precise answer. Growth percentages, asset value, expansion targets. This time, the response came without calculation. "This," he said. Jada followed his gaze. No elaboration was needed. The change showed itself in smaller habits, too. Roger began silencing his phone during dinner instead of placing it face up. He ignored non-urgent calls after a certain hour. Weekend mornings, once reserved for market analysis, became time spent on the living room floor, assembling toys or reading instructions he once would have delegated. None of those actions weakened his business standing. If anything, his team became more decisive, forced to operate without waiting for his constant oversight. Control hadn't disappeared, it had matured. At work, one of the board members commented during a review. "You seem less aggressive lately." Roger considered that. "I'm more selective," he replied. "With what?" "With what actually needs my energy." The distinction was subtle but clear. Not every opportunity deserved pursuit. Not every risk deserved attention. One quiet night, after Leora had fallen asleep, Roger walked through the apartment, turning off lights. He paused at the doorway of the small room where the crib stood. Inside, the soft rise and fall of steady breathing filled the space. Months earlier, he would have checked a financial dashboard before bed. Now he checked to make sure his daughter was comfortable. He adjusted the blanket slightly, careful not to wake her, then stood there a second longer than necessary, not out of worry, out of gratitude. Back in the living room, Jada watched him return. "You check twice every night," she said. Roger gave a faint smile. "I used to double-check contracts," he replied. "This feels more important." Jada didn't argue. The man who once believed freedom meant having no attachments had discovered something different. Freedom wasn't the absence of responsibility. It was the ability to choose what truly mattered and protect it. Roger still built companies, still negotiated deals, still carried the discipline that had shaped his success. But now, those things served a life instead of replacing it. And in that quiet shift, his definition of winning changed completely. Because the achievement that once defined him, wealth, influence, control, no longer stood at the center. A small apartment, a shared meal, a child learning to stand. Those moments, simple and easily overlooked by the world, became the clearest proof of something he had spent years chasing without realizing it. Not more, just meaning. Time moved forward the way it always does, without asking whether anyone felt ready. Days blended into weeks, and the routines that once felt new slowly became normal. Morning light through the curtains, soft sounds from the crib before the rest of the apartment woke, coffee shared in comfortable silence before the day pulled everyone in different directions. Nothing dramatic, just life, steady and unremarkable in the best possible way. Roger still carried the discipline that had built his success. He still arrived at meetings prepared, still made decisions others hesitated over, still understood how to protect what he had worked years to create. But something inside him had shifted permanently. The urgency that once pushed him to fill every second had softened. He no longer felt the need to prove his worth through constant motion. Some evenings he left the office before sunset, not because he had finished everything, but because he understood that work would still be there tomorrow. Moments at home would not. One quiet night after dinner, the apartment settled into its usual calm. Leora slept, the room lit only by a small lamp near the couch. Roger sat back, loosening his tie, watching the peaceful stillness that once would have made him restless. Now it steadied him. Jada glanced over. "You're quiet tonight." "Just thinking," he said. "About work?" Roger shook his head. "About how close I came to missing all of this." There was no self-pity in his voice, just recognition. Jada didn't respond with reassurance or correction. Some realizations don't need commentary. For years, Roger had believed responsibility would trap him, limit his options, reduce his freedom, complicate the clean structure he had built his life around. Instead, it had done something unexpected. It had given his choices direction. Without something meaningful to return to, success had felt like constant motion without arrival. Now, even the busiest days had a clear end point. Home. One evening, as he passed the small nursery on his way to turn off the lights, Roger paused at the doorway. Leora slept peacefully, one tiny hand resting near her cheek. He stepped inside quietly, adjusting the blanket with careful precision, a habit he never skipped. Not because anything was wrong, because it mattered. He stood there a moment longer, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. Months earlier, he would have called this kind of pause unproductive. Now it felt essential. Back in the living room, Jada watched him return. "You check on her every night," she said softly. Roger sat beside her. "I used to check numbers before I slept," he replied. "This feels like a better habit." A faint smile crossed her face. The man who once said, "I'll never accept this baby," had become the one who quietly made sure the nursery door stayed slightly open, just enough to hear if anything changed. Not out of fear, out of care. Some people run from responsibility because they believe it will close their world in, limit their choices, steal their independence. Roger had believed the same thing. What he learned instead was simpler. Responsibility didn't take his freedom. It gave his freedom a purpose. He didn't stop being ambitious, didn't abandon the companies or the discipline that shaped him. He just stopped letting those things define the entire measure of his life, because success without someone to share it with had once felt impressive, but empty. Now even ordinary evenings carried a quiet sense of completion. Later that night, as the apartment lights dimmed and the city outside slowed, Roger walked past the nursery one last time. He didn't step inside, just paused, listening. Everything was calm. He nodded to himself and continued down the hall, not checking out of anxiety, checking because it mattered. Life hadn't become perfect. There were still difficult days, disagreements, unexpected problems. But the fear that once drove his biggest mistake no longer controlled his decisions. In its place stood something steadier, presence, responsibility, care chosen, not avoided. And in that quiet shift, the man who once measured his worth by what he could control finally understood something he had spent years missing. The moments he was most afraid of were the ones that gave his life meaning. Some stories end with a dramatic twist. This one ends with something quieter. A man who once believed success meant staying untouched by responsibility now checks a nursery door before going to bed, just to be sure everything is all right. No applause, no headlines, just a different kind of victory, the kind that doesn't show up in business magazines. If you've ever pushed someone away because you were afraid of what that responsibility might change in your life, you're not alone. Sometimes fear sounds logical in the moment. It protects your comfort, your routine, your sense of control. But later, when the noise fades, it becomes clear what that protection actually cost. Roger learned that the hard way, not because he lacked intelligence, but because emotional risk is the one challenge success doesn't automatically prepare you for. So here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Have you ever said something you wish you could take back, only realizing its weight after the silence that followed? If you have, share your experience in the comments. Not the perfect version, the honest one. You never know who might read it and feel less alone in their own story. If this story reminded you that real strength isn't about avoiding responsibility, but choosing what truly matters, take a second to like the video. It helps stories like this reach people who might be at the exact point in their life where one decision could change everything. And if you enjoy powerful, realistic storytelling that doesn't just entertain, but leaves you thinking long after it ends, make sure you're subscribed to Mr. Williams Storytime for more real-life transformation stories. Because sometimes the most important moments in life don't arrive with noise. They arrive quietly, and they change everything.